Good morning. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this beautiful auditorium, to this magnificent city, to Italy, to the European Union, which my country now is leaving. In order to understand Brexit and other troubling phenomena of our current era, I want to take a step back. I want to think about democracy, what it means. I want to think about why we are now living with the rise of authoritarian populism across the world. And I want to dig deeper. I want to look at what's underpinning all this in some of the deep structures of our social and political order. And that's why I start with an image of the foundation of the United Nations, very famous picture. And I will come on to why this picture is important in a moment. Many states today claim they are democratic, but the history of our political institutions reveals how fragile and vulnerable democracy can be. Just think of 20th century Europe, and that alone makes it clear how remarkably difficult democracy is to create and sustain. After all, fascism, Nazism, and Stalinism nearly obliterated democracy just a few decades ago. And yet today we are witnessing the resurgence of authoritarianism and new threats to democracy. Why? Democracy is built on the values of citizenship and on the equal political freedom of all citizens. The equal standing of every member of the political community is the heartbeat, the justification, the legitimacy of democracy. The ideal, the hope, the aspiration of democracy is to include all citizens, to ensure a government of self-determination, accountable to the people, and to find ways of accommodating all our differences in a peaceful political process. Even in our imperfect world, our fraught and imperfect world, the idea of the politics of compromise and accommodation to each other, the heartbeat, the bedrock, the foundation of democracy, can just about survive. Political compromises are made, negotiations continue, rhetoric rises and falls with the ebb and flow of democratic argument. Barring extreme examples, lawmakers from different sides of the aisle of politics can just about get along with each other. Even if they disagree, they recognize that each other has views which are sincere and reasonably founded. However, today, this fragile balance of political compromise and negotiations appears to be eroding in many countries, with advocates of opposing views dehumanized, mocked, and sometimes threatened. Recent examples, of course, are Trump's America to Brexit Britain, from Orban's Hungary to Modi's India, from Erdogan's Turkey to Duterte's Philippines, across the world. When political systems become tolerant to falsehood and deceit on seismic levels, and when they even offer promotion to those who champion lies, democracy becomes vulnerable and fragile. And when those who oppose this are ridiculed and cast aside, the politics of accommodation begins to fracture. The retreat to nationalism and militant identity politics is counter to the process of accommodation and compromise, which has underpinned European and world peace since the end of the Second World War. It's as if all that was learned in the wake of the Second World War and the Holocaust and the Gulag risks being undone. And yet it would be false, of course, to assign the responsibility for the erosion of democracy and the politics of compromise and negotiation just to the rise of right-wing populist politics. Exclusionary politics of all kinds, of course, are prevalent. It's just at this time we live with the rise of a particular brand of populist authoritarian politics. Why is this? What has happened? How do we explain this? In order to grasp the reasons why we are at a crossroads in global politics, it's important to understand the deep drivers of political change in recent decades. So I want to dig deep a bit now. And one of the central concepts I think we need to understand this, to unlock this, is gridlock, and the way it threatens the reach and hold of that precious post-war settlement which put in place not just the UN, but the Bretton Woods institutions, but a whole range of institutions that were the condition for the flourishing of the post-World War order. This is now at risk. Why? So let's start with the foundation of the United Nations. The post-war institutions were put in place deliberately, with careful design, to create a peaceful and prosperous world order. And it created the conditions under which many of us could benefit from forming stable political institutions, developing companies and corporations that could trade across the world, investing abroad, creating global production chains, engaging with all those kinds of activities that today we call globalization. I won't explain all this, but it's basically, it argues that in the post-war period, you had the post-war institutional establishment increasing a world of interdependence, which needed institutions to govern it, which created more interdependence. And this was all motored and pushed forward, of course, by capitalism, which expands, and technology, which changes. The last 60 years or more have been in this virtuous circle of change. I am not suggesting for a moment that the post-war institutional order is the only cause of the dynamic form of globalization we've all witnessed and benefited from in the last several decades. But what I want to suggest is that the post-war order allowed a thriving of human activity because it took place in a relatively open, relatively peaceful, relatively liberal, relatively predictable, institutionalized world order. It was an effective design which unleashed globalization for 70 years, which created a huge rise of Asia and so on. Unparalleled change in a very short time. However, today I want to suggest to you that the conditions of this successful period of prosperity and growth are now being eroded. That is, the economic and political shifts, in large part attributable to the success of the post-Cold War order, are now grinding it into gridlock. In many areas, from nuclear proliferation, the explosion of small arms sales, failed states, global poverty and inequality, biodiversity losses, water deficits, and climate change, in all these areas, multilateralism is now either ineffective or threadbare. Why? There are 4 reasons: emerging multipolarity, institutional inertia, problems are hard, and our institutional order is fragmented. Let me just explain these to you very briefly. First, reaching agreements in international negotiations has become tougher because of the new rise of powers like India, China, and Brazil. Not because they've risen, of course, but because a more and larger diverse array of interests have to be hammered into agreement for any global deal to be made. On the one hand, multipolarity is a positive sign of development. The world is developing. On the other hand, it brings more voices and interests to the table, which are hard to weave into coherent agreements. For example, there have been 8 or 9 major trade agreements in the world since 1945, until 20 years ago in Doha, when the Doha trade round broke down. One of the reasons it broke down is because increasing number of voices from an increasing number of countries are able to say to the West, to the United States, and to Europe, if this is the only agenda on the table, we're not going to accept it. So international negotiations have become harder and more difficult to achieve. This is partly because, this is partly because the issues as well which we have to deal with are more complex now. They're trans-border issues, they cross boundaries, and they penetrate deep into the domestic politics of our societies. So a more multipolar world coincides with a more complex world. It's hard to govern an interdependent world. It's hard to govern a global economy. It's hard to find solutions to climate change. So you have an emerging multipolar world, which is a sign of the success of the post-war order, colliding with increasing complexity of issues around which it's hard to agree. This against the background of a UN system founded in 1945, it made sense then, but is increasingly unable to cope with the range of issues it faces now. It's no longer fit for purpose, and a highly fragmented international terrain. All these four reasons that I've suggested here underpin why the world as we know it today finds it increasingly difficult to reach agreement on pressing issues. To manage the global economy, to prevent environmental destruction, to rein in nuclear proliferation, or confront other global challenges, we must cooperate. But many of our tools of cooperation, from multilateralism to treaty negotiations and so on, are now hard to be effective. It's now hard for them to be effective. Signs of this today are everywhere. Climate change is threatening the world as we know it. Conflicts in the Middle East continue to run out of control. Small arms sales proliferate despite all efforts to contain it. Migration has increased rapidly and destabilizing many societies. Inequality threatens the fabric of social life across the world. Today, it's gridlock that has a self-reinforcing element, and it also underpins the rise of populist authoritarianism. And this is my final slide and helps explain why. First, as I've suggested, we face a multilateral system that is less and less able to manage the complexity and the growing interdependence of the world order we live with. That's gridlock. Second, in many areas, this has led to real and in many cases serious harm to major sectors of the global population, often creating complex and disruptive knock-on effects. Perhaps the most spectacular example, of course, was the 2008-9 global financial crisis, which wrought havoc on the world economy in general and on many countries in particular. Third, these developments have important major impetus to significant political destabilization. Rising income inequality, a long-term trend in many economies, has been made all the more relevant by the global financial crisis, reinforcing a stark division between those who benefited from globalization, digitization, and the automation of the economy, and those who feel left behind, including many working-class voters in industrialized countries. This division is especially acute in spatial terms, in the cleavage between global cities that have more in common with each other than they do with their own hinterlands. So perversely, despite the rise of Scottish nationalism, London and Edinburgh have more in common with each other in many respects than they do with the rest of the countries to which they are attached, with huge significant and political implications. Global cities like London, Paris, Shanghai, New York, San Francisco, Verona, have become nodes of power and influence in the global economy. Their citizens have benefited directly as opportunities have sharply risen. By contrast, those in the hinterlands, typically rural areas, deindustrialized cities, have often felt left behind in absolute and relative terms, building up frustrations and resentments. The effect has been profound, with a number of nationalist and populist movements emerging, and in some cases, of course, not just winning elections, but seizing power. So the financial crisis is one clear area where gridlock has undercut the management of global challenges, producing political destabilization. There are many areas. I could discuss terrorism. Don't have time. But the failure to manage terrorism properly links to something else, which is the destructive impact of the global governance of migration, which has had a haunting effect on European politics. With millions of refugees fleeing their homelands, many recipient countries have experienced a potent political backlash from right-wing nationalist groups and disgruntled populations, which further reduces the ability of these countries to generate effective solutions to problems at the regional and global level. Hence, at the national level, in reaction, you have Brexit. I don't think the Brexit vote would be won today. It was won at just that moment when the borders of the Middle East were breaking down as a result of the war in Syria and in Libya, which awakened those borders, which created channels into Europe, which was dramatized on television and allowed populist right-wing politics to seize the moment and to present it as a threat to their popular bases. But behind all that is this great cycle of causality. We see these trends across many different kinds of countries, but the anti-global backlash is heterogeneous and full of contradictions. It encompasses terrorism in the name of Islam and Islamic phobia, discrimination against Muslims. It includes leftists' rejection of trade agreements and right-wing rejections of environmental agreements. The powerful tie that unites these disparate movements is a rejection of globalization, a rejection of interdependence, and a rejection of the collective efforts to govern it. Those efforts which have kept the world at peace and in prosperity for 70 years. And the retreat from that is full of risks and danger. The resulting erosion of global cooperation is the fourth and final element in this causal pattern, and so it begins again. So we've moved from the virtuous circle of self-reinforcing global interdependence, which created the conditions for the peace and prosperity of the post-war years, to a negative form of gridlock, which is generating unmanaged globalization, populist nationalist backlashes, and reduces further the scope of international cooperation. Let me just summarize what I've said. At the current conjuncture, democracy lies somewhere between hope and despair. It offers hope because it shows the way to contain despotism and tyranny through the separation of powers, the rule of law, the electoral system, and the way it subjects political claims to tough scrutiny in parliamentary debate, the media, and social media. This hope builds on centuries of philosophical and political debate about the best ways to frame political communities. And modern democracy in this period of the post-war, from 1945 onwards, was supported by the post-war settlement. It allowed breakthroughs that provided momentum for several decades of sustained economic growth, geopolitical stability, and so on. However, what worked then works less well now as gridlock freezes problem-solving capacity in global politics. From the global financial crisis to new waves of migration and shifting patterns of terrorism, gridlock, alongside the calamitous failed post-9/11 wars, has helped engender a crisis of democratic politics, as the politics of accommodation gives way to populism and authoritarianism across the world. While this remains a trend, it is not yet, of course, set in stone. Hegel, the great German philosopher, reminds us in the great work, The Philosophy of Right, that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings with the coming of dusk. Wisdom comes when you look back in time and rarely when you look forward. We do not yet know how this damaging cycle will play out, but we do know that it is a fundamental challenge to the future of our public lives. Thank you very much.